welcome to the webinar on digital market and regulation. I'm Monica Postiglione. I'm the Executive Coordinator of Turin School of Regulation and Fondazione per l'Ambiente. The relationship between regulation and innovation has always been complicated and problematic, but what is always more evident today is the level of complexity that digital platforms are generating, both in terms of competition and regulatory issues. The incredible market power of big tech through network effect and the role of gatekeepers have posed new challenges for regulators, and the public institutions struggle to keep pace with the development of digital market. Today's discussion intends to analyze and deepen this relationship and the advancements that has been recently made, such as the investigation of competition in digital market of the Antitrust Commission of the Parliament in the US, which has suggested the need to break up big tech, and the Digital Service Act and the Digital Market Act just published a few days ago by the European Commission, which probably will reshape digital markets, at least in Europe, but maybe also in other contexts. Last but not least, during this webinar, we will have the chance to present the Turin School of Regulation Observatory on Digital Markets and Platform Regulation, which has just been launched. And we will discuss the basis of all this regulatory novelty in terms of antitrust and platform labors with 4 experts that I'm very happy to welcome here. So we have the pleasure to have Meltem Akkaya. She is head of Department of Strategy Developments and acting head of the Department of External Relationships and Competition Advocacy. She has been working for the Turkish Competition Authority for a long period, and she has a broad experience in handling merger and acquisition, cartel and abuse and dominant cases. And she worked as an economy editor in the Turkish daily news before joining the authority. So welcome, Meltem. Then we have Franco Becchis, who is our scientific director of the Fondazione per l'Ambiente and Turin School of Regulation. Vera Demary, that she's since 2015 head of the research unit Digitalization, Structural Change and Competition at the German Economic Institute in Cologne, and her research covers topic of the interference between competition and digitalization. And Juliet Schor, she's an economist and sociologist at the Boston College. Her research focus on the sociology of work consumption and also climate change. And her current research topics include the gig economy and the future of work. She is currently working on an NSF funded project on the algorithmic workplace. So I'm very happy to welcome you all. And before to start the discussion, I just want to mention that for those of you who wants to ask questions, you can use the Q&A chat, and hopefully, if we will have the time at the end of the discussion, we will also have time to answer some of the questions that you posed. So I leave the floor to Franco Becchis for his introduction.
Thank you, Monica. It's really a pleasure to have all the discussants that join us today for this seminar or webinar that is actually, the date is really tuned because it's 2 days that the European Union has released the draft of Digital Market Act and the Digital Service Act. And this regulatory step is a very important step that comes alongside an international debate that has dominated the academy and the policymaker in the last 2 years. A debate that ranges from European Union, United States, Australia, UK, Singapore, just to quote some. And the interesting things is that all across this debate, the issues raised are very similar, from Canberra to Torino to New York to Berlin and Paris. And the worries are, in my impression, are concentrated on some effects. I will say which one. The first is the lock-in effects that comes alongside the big platforms. The second is the so-called gatekeeper position or entrenched position. The third is the existence of strong barriers to entry in digital markets. And the fourth is the leveraging of market power in order to capture adjacent collateral segment and markets. The fifth is the effective merger control after the big failure of recent mergers. Remember Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp and so on. And the last but not least, and an issue that I will not touch because I'm not working on it actually, is the impact on the production of news and journalistic contents. So let's start with some reminder of the components of the Digital Market Act draft and the Digital Service Act draft. Essentially, European Union intend to classify gatekeepers according to some quantitative, very precise criteria like market capitalization, revenues, number of users, and to attach to these gatekeepers a list of prohibited behavior and a list of not prohibited behavior. The fines are raised at 10% of revenue if they fail to comply, and separately in the second act, that is the act on services, European Union want to, in a way, to regulate platforms that reach more than 10% of European users, obliging platform to remove illegal contents or unsafe product from e-commerce and so on. And the penalty in this case has been suggested at 6% of global revenue. Well, there is a big debate on the potential impact of these new acts that I remember are not actually enforced for the time being. They have to pass the network of the European Council and the European Parliament, because Europe is not a state. Europe is not a federation. Europe is a union with a rather fuzzy governance, institutional governance that requires different and sometimes incomprehensible steps and passages. Anyway, it would take months before the actual enforcement of the acts itself. Let me say something on the juris background in Europe of these two new proposed acts. Since then, the legal basis of platform regulation in Europe is based on two directives that dates 15, 20 years ago. The directive on e-commerce and the directive on digital services. Unfortunately, since 15 or 20 years ago, the life is completely, the environment of digital markets have completely changed. With the help of Stefano Valerio I will show you just one slide in my presentation, that is the birth and the evolution of the main platforms in the digital environment in the last 20 years. I don't know if the slide is ready. Okay. Okay, you can see that we have a rapid evolution in terms of market capitalization of platform, starting from 2001, but accelerating in the last 10 years. So the environment is completely changed. Imagine this slide in the form of curves instead of histograms, and the picture will be very clear. Okay, we can move to and so the necessity of new regulation is absolutely based on the new problems that digital market poses. In a way, I will touch also the question of if introducing new regulation means that the old one has completely failed. I will touch this point later. Let's say that also the two acts come after a strong consultation among stakeholders, firms, and policymakers all over Europe. And so in a way, the Europe has actually coveted the phase of preparation in a very deep way in order to prevent opposition and problem when the acts will reach the European Council and the Parliament. Okay, let's touch the main breakthrough of regulation, that is the gatekeeper definition. A gatekeeper is a platform that is able to not only use the digital markets, but also control the entry, the condition of entry, the condition of staying, the condition of exiting, and the data that stem up from the position of gatekeeper are so valuable that the gatekeeper can unfairly compete with other platforms and players that use the gatekeeper infrastructure. In this sense, there is a word that is essentiality, that recall us the century-old debate about big infrastructure and the natural monopoly in railways, telephony, gas, energy, and so on. Some words about the impact and a theme, the impact on business, on which I will ask Vera Demary to say something. But let me say that the first criticism is that, well, taming gatekeepers means essentially put a brake into the effect on network economies. And the brake on network economy is potentially also a brake on innovation and development. Secondly, there is a question of threshold effect that can undermine startup growth in order to avoid the regulatory threshold above which the gatekeeper regulation would come into action. So this can be a second element of braking for the development. Anyway, some consideration can be made about the convergence of antitrust policy and regulation policy that in the past have been sometimes, they are sisters, but in the past they have not cooperated so much. And in this new framework, the instruments of antitrust will combine with the instruments of regulation in a way, opening up a new era in the public policy for market regulation. In a way, maybe an era of hybrid regulation. The stronger critics or criticism of the two new draft acts are the following. First, someone say that the treaty, the existing European treaty, in particular the 101 article, already contain the instrument to perfectly tame tacit cartel with algorithmic price, with no need of new regulation, and in particular with no need of ex ante regulation. The second criticism is, well, if you introduce these new acts, you admit in a way that antitrust policy until now has been flawed. And third, and the question that we should pose to legal experts, are there risks of compensation claims in case of use of the most hard instruments envisaged by the two acts? The most hard instrument is the split of platform or the prohibition of merger. Well, having played this tribute to the pluralism, let me introduce a last question before to conclude and to have our first round, that is cloud and artificial intelligence. If cloud and artificial intelligence are the driver of the future development of digital markets, well, maybe cloud is more prone to competition than traditional digital services. And maybe too, artificial intelligence is more prone to competition. And in this case, should regulation be more wary, more distant, more prudent? Well, there are a lot of questions that I have not quoted. For example, labor issues, for example, data sharing, that is another big obligation for platform classified as gatekeepers. But I think that with two rounds of opinion with my discussants, we will have the occasion to say something about all the relevant aspects. And that's why it's a pleasure now to be joined by my three distinguished discussants. And let me start with Juliet Schor from Boston College, that I know is working on, in particular, on labor issues. And let me just remember, Juliet, that the California decision to save Uber from treating workers as employee has saved 4% of firm costs. That is a huge amount of money. So Juliet, up to you.
Yeah, that was really interesting. And what's going on in Europe is fascinating for someone from the US now, just because you all are so far ahead of us in terms of regulating these companies. So the situation with California and its implications for the rest of the country and possibly other places, I think are really important. So just a little bit of background. In the United States, when these, the labor platforms, and here I'm talking about ride hail, Uber and Lyft, the food delivery platforms, and we have different ones from Europe. You have Deliveroo, and of course we both have Uber Eats. Shopping platforms. When these entities began, they were mostly breaking laws. So in ride hail, they were breaking all the laws around taxis. Airbnb, which of course is a global platform, very popular in Europe as well, was breaking laws around accommodations. So in both cases, they broke these laws with impunity. Local governments in the United States basically did nothing to stop them. And the reasons for that were a few things. One is the economic possibilities they represented. They were launched in the beginning of the Great Recession. The second was the fear of stifling innovation. The third was the power of the users and the consumers. And there's a fourth one that people, I think, haven't really understood, which is that a number of these platforms had investors who were the most powerful firms in the country, both Silicon Valley firms like Google, but also Wall Street, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, et cetera. So they came with really big power behind them. Things started to change in 2018 after almost a decade, and when the problems of these services began to be quite evident, and people really began organizing against them. And I think one of the important, a point to be made is this sector is different than Google, Facebook, etc. It's in person and it tends to be local. So when I talk about these firms, that's what I'm talking about. And they have some different economics as a result of that. So we can ask so in 2018, you get a turning point. You start to get regulation, which is happening at the municipal level because accommodations and ride hail and delivery are all regulated at the municipal level in the United States. And so you have action on misclassification. As Franco said, to reclassify these workers as employees instead of independent contractors. You have Airbnb laws passed across the country, and you start to get some regulations on food delivery. As a result of court decisions and more pressure, the California legislature in September of 2019 passed a law called Assembly Bill 5, which converted all of these workers to employees and converted lots of other workers to employees too, journalists. And so there was a lot of outcry about the problems of this law because it was very broad. And as a result, the gig labor companies, most prominently Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash, began a drive to carve themselves out of this law. That was, they put an initiative on the ballot in California, which came to a vote in November of 2020, called Proposition 22, and it created a special category for their workers and very, very minimal provisions. In theory, a minimum wage, but because it doesn't include waiting time, might end up effectively at about $6 an hour, according to research, and very minimal health benefits. And also, it required a 7/8 majority, supermajority of the California legislature to overturn it. So basically, no possibility for employee status. So what can we take from this law? Like what are the lessons and where are we now in terms of regulation? So the first point is the whole regulatory situation has really become a flashpoint on a number of issues: labor issues, issues around traffic and congestion, issues around housing availability when we're talking about accommodations. So Proposition 22 could be a major harbinger of things to come. As soon as they won, the gig companies began to try and influence legislators in other democratic states to try and get replicas, and they're working on a national law. And probably the most worrisome thing for opponents is that the brother-in-law of the vice president-elect, Kamala Harris, is the chief legal officer for Uber. So there are very tight connections between Uber and the Biden administration. We worry a lot about this third category because we think it will erode protections for employees. So more firms will try and move to this third category. So let me just say a couple of last things. I mean, the first point is, I think the win in California shows the power of these platforms vis-a-vis the state in the United States. They have unlimited money. What they were really able to do here was purchase their own labor law, because it was the imbalance in money was really key. The anti-forces had about $10 million and the companies had over 200 million. So it really is a matter of purchasing legislation, a very worrisome situation. To the extent that there's a check on that, it has to do with a fight within the Democratic Party. The gig companies represent the corporate wing of the party, and you have progressives and unions who are fighting them, and that's a larger battle, on many issues. And so, we don't know how it will turn out. But there are two economic points that I think are worth making. The first is that with gig labor, the economics, the platform economics are very different than with Google, Facebook, and the other platforms that really just have no person, they're all online. And that is that there are almost no network externalities. So the economics of bigness don't really make sense for the local services, because for a company like Uber, it's really a very limited network that it needs to get to efficiency. Unlike, with Facebook, every additional user represents, some additional value to the network. So we really should think about regulating them very differently. The second is, it's not clear there's a path to profitability in ride hail and food delivery, which are two of the three biggest sectors. These are platforms that have long operated without profitability. Uber especially is the most unprofitable company in, I think, human history. It has engaged in predatory pricing to grow. And so if there is a profitable, there is profitability available in the possible, but it's at a very, very reduced scale from what these platforms currently are trying to operate at. They're attempting to dominate the markets, drive out all the competition, and then they can raise prices so much to make money. But if they do that, their market's going to shrink a lot, because a lot of the consumers are only in that market at the moment because the prices are so low and because they're so predatory. I mean, Uber and Lyft have subsidized their rides at about 40% for a long time. So it's a very different economics than the other big tech companies, and I think you know, they all need to be regulated and their power needs to be broken up. They're all too big and too powerful in my view, but we need kind of different approaches, I think, in the labor sector than in some of the others. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliet. And I hope you could do also a second round later. In case you cannot, I will pass you to you before. And now, Vera, what is your main impression about the potential impact of these new draft acts on businesses, or also, if you want, on consumers themselves? Vera.
Thank you, Franco, for your interesting input, and thank you also, Juliet. I learned a lot about Proposition 22. It was in California, and I think it's very interesting because I've never thought about the differentiation between labor platforms and, well, all the others in that much detail. But I think you may have a point there. I'd just like to talk for a couple of minutes about the trade-off between regulation on the one hand and reining companies in that, well, they don't stick to market rules, so to speak, just to say this very generally. And on the other hand, we have entrepreneurial freedom, we have innovation, we have investment in new business ideas. And obviously there's a trade-off. If we regulate, like we're doing in the EU now, if we're regulating these companies strongly, this will have an effect on all the markets that they're active in, and we can't disregard this. So Franco, you also already talked about a couple of points on how network effects are broken up. If there's sort of a threshold, this might impact innovation in the sense that it's not as attractive to innovate anymore if you can't benefit, if you can't make a profit from it, because that's what's needed to be innovative. You are taking risks as a company, just very generally speaking. Think about startup companies, they're dealing in new business models, they're taking a risk with their business models, with their ideas, they're investing a lot in innovation, and they need to be able to profit from this later, otherwise it's not a valid, a stable business model. This is what Juliet talked about with the ride-hailing platforms and the food delivery platforms. That might not be, in the end, might not work out or might not be profitable in the sense that we're thinking now. So I think what this regulation in Europe, to come back to the Digital Service Act and the Digital Market Act, what they're doing is they're affecting markets, and so we need to think very carefully about whether we really want it this way. I'm a bit critical of both these acts in some points. So obviously, I think there's some issues there that are very clearly needed to be regulated, like illegal content, like product safety issues. I think there's no discussion there, at least from my side. But I think we talked a bit about gatekeepers today, and I think the definition that the European Commission puts forth is much too wide, because we're covering with this a lot of companies, even more than usually you think about Google, you think about Facebook. Now I heard that they're even thinking about Airbnb or Booking.com in a sense they might belong to the gatekeeper platforms. I think what the definition that the Digital Service Act, the DSA, puts forth is missing is that there needs to be a relevance of the platform for the market. So there cannot be a lot of alternatives. They're trying to make it, the definition, independent of market power, more or less independent of market power. So they're saying you don't need to be a monopoly to be a gatekeeper, but I think that's not working because it covers too much, because we're going into these markets and we're stifling innovation with it. It might just very well be necessary in some areas, but I think we need to carefully think in which markets we have gatekeepers and in which markets we don't. Just to give you an example of what I mean is take Amazon. A lot of people are saying Amazon is clearly a gatekeeper, everyone orders there, but it very much depends on which market we're talking about. If you want to order clothes, for example, you might just go elsewhere because there's a lot of alternatives that are often even better, and people ordering clothes might not use Amazon for this. So we might have a problem here defining the gatekeeper as a company. You need to look at the market and you need to look at the ecosystem before interfering with business models. And this is basically my point. And then I would just like to make one other point that we haven't talked about yet today, which is the proposed ante regulation. So the Digital Markets Act proposes to go further than the existing competition or antitrust policy instruments, and to regulate before there is a misuse of power, of market power, because before there even is market power. And I think this is a very, very far-going change in the way we approach competition policy, because until now, what we're doing is we're looking at markets, we're looking at who is in a position to abuse market power, and then we're looking at whether they're doing it or not. And if they're not doing it, it's fine. And there's no way to prevent them from their business dealings. And I think this is the way it's working, and this is the way it should be. What's going to happen if the DMA goes through as proposed is that there will be an earlier intervention by competition authorities, and maybe Meltem can talk about this in more detail. And I think this is potentially very harmful, because I don't know how competition authorities are going to judge whether the market dynamics that we have in these markets. Platforms can become large very fast, but they don't need to. There's a lot of examples where it didn't work out this way, and where there wasn't a monopoly position because something happened beforehand, some other companies took away parts of the market. And I think what I'm trying to say is that we need to look at where's market failure, and where do the instruments that we have now, like Article 102 in the TFEU, where don't they cover the problems that we're seeing? And there's a lot of cases right now where these articles are applied, and I think we have valid instruments that should be used. And I think in this sense, the DMA and the DSA are taking it a bit too far for the whole, I would say, innovation incentives and investment incentives in these sorts of business models. And I think, just to make a very strong point at the end, I think we would argue differently if these were European companies. And I think that shouldn't be the case. It shouldn't matter. So I'm going to stop at this point, and I'm happy to take questions and get
Vera, thank you very much, in particular for having remembered 2 points that I have not discussed in my short presentation. That is one, or maybe the one I have discussed, the cloud feature that is more prone to competition, maybe. And the second, very important, is the ex ante instruments to tame monopolies, instead of long procedure, long legal debate after the damage has already been done, as in the case of Google. So I think that there is a lot of questions and problems that Meltem can help us to districate. Meltem as a very, very open-minded antitrust and regulation expert. Meltem, up to you to summarize this first round.
Okay, well, Franco, thank you very much for giving me this platform to speak up again. And it's always a pleasure being part of the Turin School of Regulations activities. This time is more active because we have 2 prominent speakers. I should thank Vera and Juliet, and also I should thank Fulvia, Monica, and Franco again for organizing this interesting debate. But clearly, we are moving from what we used to see. Well, in the last 10 years or so, or in the last decade, things have changed a lot. So our mindset has been changing. Last Tuesday, these two acts, which are going to shape up Europe's future digital agenda, if you like, those are that announced, have shaken the platform world as well as the innovation side, as Vera has very rightly said. But the problem lies with the fact that, unfortunately, what we are seeing now is quite different than conventional markets. In conventional markets, we used to look at how products are sold or how products are served. Instead, in digital markets, we have to check and we have to make sure how products are being produced or how products and services are made. So this is the main distinction between a conventional market and a digital market. And that leaves us, unfortunately, from being a competition expert to a regulator. There is the risk of under-enforcement and over-enforcement. As Vera rightly said, there is a huge risk of over-enforcement. So we seem to be dealing with the business models of companies. These are private companies. Google, what is Google? It's an Alphabet. It's a company called Alphabet, private company called Alphabet. And what we are doing in Google Shopping case, Google AdSense, AdWords case, is that we are looking into the business model of a private company. We're trying to intervene. We're trying to see how the company moves. And this is making us a regulator. And much as we don't like, as competition enforcers myself, I don't like to be a regulator. There's no other way, unfortunately, with these companies, because they are too big, as defined in the Act, the Digital Markets Act and elsewhere. They are gatekeepers. They keep the gate. The other small ones, the other startups or the other businesses has to use this framework in order to function. So think of any company without Google. Can anyone exist without Google now? The answer is straightforward. No, that's not possible. And what is Google? Is Google a search engine or a music streaming, as it is the case with YouTube? Or is it a messaging company? What is Google or what is Facebook? So without these companies, now any company, any service cannot survive. The advertising scheme has changed. What is offline became online. So rightly said, when announcing these Digital Service Act and Digital Markets Act, Ms. Vestager said on Tuesday, she said very rightly, she said, what is online is now offline. So there is one world, and what is illegal in offline is illegal online. So there is no distinction. We have to combine these two things. Mm-hmm. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, unfortunately, in the case of a competition analysis, if there is a big enough company that is called to be dominant, there were tools that we used to do in the past for conventional markets. That would be either predatory pricing, that is pricing below a certain cost level, or excessive level abuses, excessive pricing abuses. If a dominant company has excessive prices that we used to, then we use certain analysis, but these are not sufficient to these companies. Because first of all, these companies are ecosystems. They leverage their market power in one market to others quite easily. And it's very difficult to define where Google is, and if Google has a maps problem, then is it just its market power in Google Maps, or also combining the whole system of ecosystems? So you are not seeing one company, you are seeing a huge ecosystem of companies. It's a combination of all services together. And this is why all the existing competition tools are quite outdated, unfortunately insufficient. So we all needed new powers, new tools, new mindsets, unfortunately, because what they are doing is, they are exploiting their market powers. So these are in competition law and consumer law, they are called exploitative abuses. The agencies or the countries who have exploitative consumer protection laws embedded in their competition laws are quite lucky ones. Unfortunately, Turkey is not one of them. I know many European states are also like this. They don't have consumer protection laws embedded into competition law. So you have to stop at the analysis at a certain point. You cannot take it further. You need another tool. You cannot, there is a problem, there is an infringement, but the tools you have are not enough to come up with a solution. So you stop, which we have already. And so it happened with the commission also. They stopped with Google. Well, there is an infringement. Yes, it is. Is it a competition infringement? It looks like. But how are you going to name it? There's no name, unfortunately. It's not excessive pricing. It's not predatory pricing. It's not an exclusive dealing. What is it? It's an exploitative abuse. So it's in the gray zone, in between competition law and consumer protection law. That's the gray zone abuse. And this is why the commission, being quite indeed, to my knowledge, very courageous, and Vera was right. I think this is the response, the European response to US companies. This is a little bit of making walls so that US companies, US platforms, to lessen them, to stop their power a little bit. This is how that is perceived by these platforms, but unfortunately there was no other way. So, and this is not only the case in the Europe, also US has the same ending up. On October, US House of Representatives had a report, a very comprehensive report, 450 pages of report on competition abuses in digital markets. And they came up almost with the same results. They said there is a monopolization. These platforms are abusing their market powers. And the other thing which both sides of the Atlantic emphasized is the existence of killer acquisitions, which is quite not as well as very well known. Killer acquisition is the acquisition, the acquiring of small startups, innovative startups by these gigantic platforms with a good money. They are paid a lot of money, and then they have new services added to their ecosystems. And according to the US House report, starting from early 1990s, these four big platforms, GAFA, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, they have acquired 560 startups. And that's the huge number. That we have never seen such an activity in conventional markets like this. Well, there is, if you look at oil companies, well, they acquire only 1 or 2 in 10 years. Or if you look at retail markets in offline, there is no activity like this. If it goes like this, there would be no new innovation. So this is a little bit of answering Vera's problem of innovation, but innovation doesn't die with regulation. Unfortunately, innovation has already died because of the existence of these platforms, because they don't let anyone bloom. If someone comes up with a genius idea, if there is an engineer that has a good idea, if it has a little platform, just the time about it's gonna bloom, then these companies acquire them. That's the case with Waze. Google acquired Waze, and Waze wasn't even earning money. So it became now another function. That was the case with YouTube. YouTube was almost not popular around the time Google bought it, Alphabet get it. So it's become quite prominent now. So this is, I think, by these two acts, what Commission is doing is indeed, it's trying to level the playing field for innovation and trying to foster innovation. Otherwise, we won't have any innovative companies. If everyone is acquired by these gigantic firms, and some of them, indeed, this is why they're called killer acquisitions, is that most of the times, Google or whatever that platform is, acquires this genius startup and then stop its functions just because it thinks it's a threat. Because it would be nice if the service was going on, like in the case of Google Maps or Waze or YouTube, that at least you have the service. But otherwise, if it stops and it kills the service, then you are already left out without an innovation. So that's one of the critics, my answer to the critics. And the second one is that we need new tools, and unfortunately, we need ex ante tools in the form of do's and don'ts, So these platforms, they're big enough platforms, not everyone is going to do it. So from my understanding, the platform which reaches up to 45 million users is going to be the target of these acts. So that's 10% of the whole European population. That would be, that they would be required to follow up these ex-ante rules. This is the regulation and competition law getting all together, as Ms. Vestager last week said in OECD. She said that regulation, that I know that Franco is going to like this statement now. Franco, this goes for you. She said regulation and competition has to go hand in hand in these digital markets. Unfortunately, if you like it, if you don't like it, she said. I have to agree. I don't like it. I don't like to be a regulator myself. I was thinking my main job was to foster the level playing field for competitors, but there's no way. We don't have any tools, unfortunately. Whatever tools existing tools do not suffice to these new and innovative companies. Plus, there's another problem. That's the time frame. Competition analysis takes up to 2.5 years, 3 years. And we don't have that time for these digital markets. They're too quick. When you start a Google case in 2010, let's assume, Google comes up with a new product, a new idea that the case is already outdated. So you have to be quick. And how can you be quick? Unfortunately, the only way to do it is to an ex-ante rule rather than an ex-post analysis, because in ex-post, in digital markets, the damage is huge, which was the case in killer mergers. Maybe had competition agencies been able to catch these mergers while they were happening, we wouldn't be seeing these gigantic platforms now. And that's what the US FTC and DOJ is digging down these days in medical companies, because they thought if some of the medical companies weren't bought by those gigantic medical companies, we would be maybe seeing more activity in medical environment rather than, as you see all around the world, we're talking about the vaccine companies, but there are only a handful of companies. We don't have 100 medical companies. Why is that so? Because these small ones were already acquired by the big ones. So looking back 10 years is not a good idea. You have to do it right now. And that's my understanding. And that's how both sides of the Atlantic are doing. My only, the point that I would side with Vera would be the case that I'm always very careful when it comes to this the wording of using sanctions as a last resort to divest a company. For me, that's a very tricky word because it says in the Act, also in the House reports of the US, it says if other measures and remedies are not enough to tackle these issues, competition issues in digital markets, the last resort would be to divest the company into pieces or to stop IPR rights. And that would be a very risky resort. So who's going to decide? And I think that there we would have a Europe versus US problem. I'm not sure if that would be the case, that will be the case in the US, but perhaps there is the risk of US companies facing in Europe. And if you look at what happened, as we already discussed last time with Franco, if you look at what happened to TikTok in US, if you remember what President Trump was doing against TikTok, he was attacking TikTok just because it was a Chinese application, because he wanted an American application. So he wanted the shares of TikTok to be bought by an American company. He wasn't against TikTok. He wasn't against the application itself. He didn't like that it was Chinese. He thought under the security umbrella, he said, oh, for security reasons, TikTok should be American. Well, TikTok, everybody uses, nobody cares if TikTok is Chinese or American or European. If it's a useful application, we all use it. That's for me, that's the case. I don't care whose application is it. I don't check the nationality of an application. That's where I stop. And I leave the floor back to Franco, and thank you again.
Thank you, Meltem. Thank you very much for this Platonic overview, and in particular for having remembered the geopolitical implication of regulation and antitrust. Let me remember that maybe the only European platform that will fall into the gatekeeper category will be Booking.
Right.
All the other are from United States. So this can be a problem, maybe a less important problem after the presidential election in USA, but who knows? Let's see. But let me change for a while the perspective and going back to Juliet for a question that seems collateral, but in my opinion is crucial. The question of trust. Trust in digital markets is an asset, an intangible asset. And my impression is that without a minimum level of trust between consumers and platform, workers and platform, and so on, the digital market could collapse. Do you think that the big names are exploiting trust in an unsustainable way? Let me just say my anthropological impression in this day of lockdown, seeing all these delivery van running like crazy in the streets of my village, in the countryside, to deliver goods. And my sensation as a consumer is to be overwhelmed by these giants in terms also of trust. Who are you? What do you do with my data? What do you do with competitors? And so on. Juliet.
Yes. You know, I would think about trust in two ways. On the one hand, you have the risk, personal risk that the users face when they make these transactions. So when you get into the ride hail, is the driver going to be safe? When you let a person into your home for Airbnb, you know, are they going to do something terrible to you? And on that front, the companies have been pretty lucky. They have trust mechanisms, which are the ratings and reputation systems. They don't actually do very well in terms of true high quality information, but so far the platforms, the levels of malfeasance on the platform have not been so high, and they're sort of really bad actors can get screened out. I mean, this is where you see a difference from the platforms that don't have ratings, like Craigslist, which became very popular and was overrun with scams because there was no ratings and reputation information. But those rating systems are very, very low quality in the sense that almost everybody's getting very good ratings and they really don't do too much. The second kind of trust, I think, is more to what you're referring to, which is the larger impacts that these platforms are having on the societies. So whether it's a neighborhood which is overrun with congestion and pollution because there are too many ride hails, a village overrun with the vans because the levels of e-commerce are too high and they haven't adapted the delivery mechanisms to take into account the well-being of the villagers. So, you know, if there were bicycle deliveries, it would be much less a problem than big polluting vans, which take up too much space and cause traffic and so forth. And here, I think we've pretty much fallen down almost totally there's, you know, the attempts with Airbnb to try and regulate because of the, you know, so-called externalities. Where Airbnb users, hosts, guests, almost all pretty happy with what's going on. There's not a big problem within the platform, but all of these impacts on housing availability, on prices, on neighborhood quality and so forth. And the regulations, I've developed with my colleagues a regulation database of 10 major Airbnb markets in the United States. And what it looks like from our preliminary analysis is the regulations, even fairly strict ones, don't seem to be limiting the growth of Airbnb. So they don't seem to be too effective. It's easy to get around these regulations on some of these platforms. And in ride hail, and the food delivery, you also have the trust issues around the treatment of the workers, because these platforms have become highly exploitative. They're not employers, and that, you know, the users don't want that. There was a good portion of voters in California who voted for Proposition 22 because they thought it was going to help the workers, because that was the way it was presented, not realizing that actually it was taking away important rights that the workers had gained through legislation, even if they hadn't been enacted yet by the platform. So I think that the trust, the sort of biggest failings of trust are really at the social level now. And in the sector that I study, which is these personal services, they're profound. And I would just say something, you know, this is the Facebook is not my area of expertise, but what has happened on Facebook and YouTube and these content platforms is so deeply problematic, which is that they, you know, the content, your last point that you made, you know, when you began your remarks, which is that they have become these incubators of highly destructive, socially destructive content that, you know, it hasn't taken very long, but that impact is also undermining the ability of regulators to control it, because it's creating these really monstrous political forces which are so anti-state. So it's a really bad situation. It's not an easy one to deal with. I understand it's really complicated, but doing nothing seems to me to be a disaster, because we are already seeing how deeply pernicious these the platforms can be in terms of content.
Thank you, Juliet. Before to pass to Vera and Meltem for the final two intervention, I would like to show some points about our new initiative, that is the International Observatory on Digital Markets and Platform Regulation. With the help of Stefano, I will show you just the front page of the observatory. That is a kind of store, a kind of repository for regulation and antitrust sentences and the literature in the sector that you are looking at: mobility, accommodation, delivery, chores, finance, e-commerce, and also media and health in the future. For the time being, the observatory is still in a work in progress phase, and let's just show you an example on how it can be used by scholars, policymakers, and students. Stefano will show you, for example, the map of mobility regulation, and now he will decide to concentrate on California, I suppose, or maybe another state. Okay, so we are going to Los Angeles in California, and we find out the law, the bill that introduced a particularly strict legal test for reducing the possibility of companies to classify workers as independent workers in California. The same we can do in Europe, for example, if we pass to Europe in another sector, Stefano, maybe, for example, accommodation. Okay, you will find in the accommodation sector the updated laws, sentences, and antitrust decision on the accommodation sector in France, Germany, Spain, Italy, and so on. Let's choose one, Stefano, the one you prefer. Okay. Okay, City of Madrid, maybe. Okay. Okay, this is the regulation of Airbnb, of short-term rental in Madrid, and you will find the text of the act and some comments. So we are developing, you see that the contents are, we have more than 200 feed in the observatory up to now. This is the text of the law. And so just as an information to my discussants and to the large audience that is following us from 70 countries today. And in the future, we hope that the observatory will become a network of contributors around the Turin School of Regulation, also to compensate the suffering for not having had the edition of our summer school in September. Our summer school that is traditionally attract thousands of applications for 23 scholars in Torino every September since 23 years, and 2020 has been the first year with no physical summer school, but we had a lot of seminars and interview and webinar like today, and hope in 2021 to restart also the physical presence in Torino, hoping also to maybe, who knows, see Juliet and Vera, because Meltem is already has been already with us for many years with her lectures. And so closing the bracket about the observatory, but we are available for further clarification. Let me pass to Vera for the question of impact on business still or others, but also if you want the question of taxes, that is very hot, taxing platforms. And,
okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Franco. I'm gonna start by saying I'm gonna bail on the taxes questions because that's not my area of expertise. Maybe someone else wants
wonderful.
But I thank you for introducing us to your observatory. I think that's very, very worthwhile. We did a study about 2 years ago on the accommodation market in Germany, and we looked at so many laws. And my question, just a quick question on the observatory, Franco, how are you updating this? I mean, do you just score the internet, or do you want?
Yeah, well, actually, me and my staff, we are following the main player, professional player on the field in different countries, in particular following Twitter and LinkedIn, and some person with which we have personal contact, like Meltem or Montero in Spain, people in Brazil, in the East Asia, and so in Israel, and so on. So it's a mixed approach, waiting for a more stable staff and a more stable feed for the observatory that for the time being is rather artisanal and rather in a way not still structured.
But I think it's a great source of information. Even now, I would be very interested to look at it and note it down the webpage. Just to give you another hint, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, there's an observatory by the European Commission on the online platform economy that's mostly, it's different from yours, it's mostly data on platforms and platform activities. I can email a link later on because we're involved in this.
We know it. We know
Oh, you
it.
know it. Okay, perfect.
Oh, yeah.
I just wanted to make one point that on another point on innovation, in a bit as a response to what Meltem said about how innovation has died because of platforms. I wrote this sentence down, because of what you call killer acquisitions. And I think you're absolutely right. This is a strategy that platforms follow, that they acquire their competitors or that they acquire startups with new novel business ideas. Sometimes they use them, sometimes they don't, and just kill them. And that's what you meant. So I think you're right in saying that there needs to be a lid on these sorts of activities, but we don't need the DMA for this. We just need a stricter merger control. And maybe even putting a moratorium on acquisitions of big tech in sort of a way. I'm very open to this because I think that's an area where things have gotten out of control, certainly. What I think hasn't been researched enough is the way innovation of platforms work, because I don't think it's correct to say there's no innovation. They're being innovative. It's just a very different way of what we're seeing with traditional platforms in non-digital market, traditional companies in non-digital markets, companies that are not platforms. So I think what we need to look at in closer detail is how innovation works with platforms and how maybe also the platform ecosystems, so business users of platforms, for example, benefit from the platform and how innovation might even be created. I mean, I'm talking about this now because I should disclose we're doing such a study. We've just started, so there's no results yet, but we're doing exactly this for the German Commission on Innovation and Research. I'm not sure if I translated this correctly, but they're doing a big report on innovation as a consultant to the German government every year. And we've been commissioned a study on innovation and platforms because of the link that hasn't been looked at in close detail. And we're very, very interested in seeing the results, because one way of innovation obviously is the acquisition of other companies, but that cannot be the only way. I'm hoping there's more to it, and I'm hoping there's a lot of positive effects and not only negative, because obviously it's a trade-off between fostering innovation, and especially in the beginning of a platform, they're being innovative, trying to reach as many markets as possible. And then once they grow large, they might be a bit more laid back about this because they don't have to be so innovative anymore. And obviously this is not something that we can want. But I think as for the point of innovation and how to deal with acquisitions, I think we just need a stricter merger control. And I think this is something that in the European Union that needs to be done urgently. So I'm going to stop here and give Meltem the chance to have
Thank you.
minutes left. Thank you.
Franco,
Meltem.
can I just have 2 minutes to respond
Yeah,
to
yeah.
the point? Would that be okay
Yeah.
for you? Okay, before you
Go.
jump to the next question. Well, I
Go.
do actually agree with Vera's point on tightening the merger control regime in every country. You know, if the target is to stop the killer mergers, but then there's a problem. There is a structural problem, because these platforms do not generate monetary values. They are too big. If you look at Uber or Airbnb, if you look at their market capitalization, unfortunately, their turnover doesn't equal to the market value that they have. Why is that so? Because all the services most of the services they provide are provided for free. These are called zero pricing platforms. Do you pay for Google? No, you don't pay. Do you pay for Gmail? Do you pay for YouTube? Unless you have premium, of course, versions. You don't pay. This is why they are quite popular, and they have huge popularity among consumers, because consumer thinks they receive these products and services for free, which is true. You don't pay through monetary values, but you pay through your data. You exchange your data in exchange for a free service. And this is why all these platforms, they don't have turnovers, huge turnovers. And this is why the European Union in many countries were unable to catch the merger of Facebook, Instagram. And this is why it created a lot of discussion in Europe to check what's going on in digital markets. And you are lucky because in Germany and Austria, you have just changed your merger control regimes. And that was a very smart move. Instead of focusing on turnover thresholds, since you know that the turnover is always it's below the threshold, Germany and Austria amended their laws in a way to include transaction costs or transaction value of the acquisition in order to catch these platforms. And this is excellent, but no results have been reached yet, to my knowledge. This was also insufficient. So that's a good move to have a tightened merger control. And this is what the US FTC and DOJ and also the European Commission in their reports are suggesting. But unfortunately, still no result yet. Even if the laws are amended in such a way, there's no result because unfortunately, they don't create monetary values. They are valuable companies, but they don't generate. When you want to buy, when you want to buy a platform, they are quite valuable. They are expensive, but they don't generate anything because they extract your data. They don't need your money. They need your data. That's the problem.
Meltem, your point is very interesting, and let me just say that there are experience of assessing the value, the shadow value of data that we deliver to platform in order to compare the value we give with the value we receive. So this is a promising field, still not complete, as you have said, but really challenging, really challenging.
I should congratulate you. Kudos to Turin School of Regulation, as always, for this initiative on updating the latest position of the platforms. That's a very interesting thing and it does indeed replace our summer school, because that would be the case. That would be the topic we would be discussing had it not been for the stupid pandemic.
Yeah.
Kudos indeed.
Sure. I have no conclusion.
Nobody has no consensus.
No conclusion, because it's impossible to conclude a debate that has been so rich, so in a way complicated, but in a way also so simple about the relationship between us consumers and this big player that overwhelm every day our digital life, and not only digital, also the physical one. And so I prefer to say, instead of concluding, to say that all this big wave of debate about the power of market players is, for me, mainly a proof of democracy, a proof of participation, a proof of trust seeking against the hidden forces of finance and business that sometimes keep the water at large and go and navigate in troubled water and in water that are uncharted. And so Turin School in particular is strictly devoted to raise the awareness about market transparency. That means also transparency of social life and democracy. And we hope that this overhaul of regulation and antitrust in Europe, and also some of you quoted the report by David Cicilline in America that has done an extraordinary work on big platform. And we hope that this new wave will help us to keep safely the values of transparency, fairness, development, inclusion, also in this troubled and sometimes uncharted digital markets. So, Juliet, has been a pleasure really to meet you. Vera, a big pleasure to have you with us, and Meltem, as always, hoping in the future to have a physical occasion to meet and to discuss. And I will now pass the screen to Monica in Torino to the short conclusion and un arrivederci a tutti.
Arrivederci Franco. Ci vediamo a Torino.
Arrivederci. Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you to all of you. It has been a very interesting discussion, and many topics have been covered. And clearly, there is a lot to say on these topics, but we will see what will happen in the next months to better understand all the consequences of these new regulatory developments that we presented. And so today it's the last webinar we organize in this year, because as you can imagine, we shift to all our activities online. And hopefully, as Franco already said, we will have the chance to see each other soon here in Torino, but probably for the first part of next year, we will continue to organize discussion and events online. And so stay tuned, because we will continue to organize this kind of discussion on the platform economy and the regulation. And Franco presented the observatory, and clearly we will like to have people using it and suggest us information, and probably there will be the possibility to organize a network of experts who will be part of the observatory, sending us information and being part of the construction of this database. So thank you very much, and see you soon, and stay well. Bye.